On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, the U.S. West Coast ports just smashed their import records. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to this episode. So we have been talking about this issue ever since President Trump announced tariffs. Now, I have argued quite extensively that many people were misunderstanding how the tariffs would impact U.S. imports. We did a whole series of videos on port updates, kind of busting a lot of myths and bad information that was out there about U.S. ports. You may remember there was a lot of doom and gloom about it. This story from Reuters back in April talks about it. Trump's escalating tariffs threaten to reverse U.S. import booms. Donald Trump's escalating tariffs are dimming the outlook for later this year, trade executives said. Dealt with a whole batch of issues regarding, empty ports. Port of Seattle was a desolate wasteland. The Port of LA and Long Beach were going to see a 35% drop in their imports. Well, we have this story now from Mike Schuller over at G-Captain. West Coast ports smash records as shippers rush ahead of the Trump tariffs. Port of LA just recorded its largest month in 117-year history of July, handling over 1 million 20-foot equivalent units, those are TEUs, as retailers and manufacturers accelerate the shipments. According to the Port of LA's executive director, our good friend Gene Soroka, quote, shippers have been front-loading their cargo for months to get ahead of tariffs, and recent activity at America's top port really tells the story. Port terminals in July were jam-packed with ships, loaded with cargo, processed without any delay, much to the credit of our dedicated longshore workers, terminals, and rail operators, truckers, and supply chains partners. Get into the numbers there. July 2025, Port of LA handled 543,000 TEUs, an 8% increase over last year. Those are just the imports coming in. Loaded exports showed a 6% improvement from 2024. Landing at 121,000 TEUs, with empty containers rising 10% to over 354,000 containers. That means in the first 7 months of 2025, the Port of Los Angeles handled nearly 6 million TEUs. That represents a 5% increase over that same period from last year. We're going to break down this data with a story over at Descartes. Mike Schuller has a summary of it. U.S. container imports surged to their second highest level on record in July 2025, reaching 2,621,910 TEUs, just 555 containers shy of the all-time high set back in May 2022. And according to Descartes Systems Group, 18.2% month-over-month increase signals a dramatic shift in global shipping patterns. We're going to look at that Descartes story and their major points, break it down for you so you'll understand what is happening with imports and shipping around the world. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. This is the story over at Descartes. I'm going to have the link to it so you can break it down. They make a whole series of major points here. I'm going to summarize some of them so that you have a better understanding. So one of the biggest points has to be that surge in the month of July, and you can see it here in the graph they provide. We saw back in June, container imports were just about 2.2 million TEU. Back in May, it was 2.1. Now, that May and June reflected a big drop. Typically, what we tend to see in the second quarter of a year is a rise in containers. This is the kind of constant surge we see of shipping coming across, and it kind of climbs up to a crescendo in right around September and October before it begins to drop off. What we saw in 2025 was that drop. This is the drop everybody was talking about. I had talked about the fact that I thought that drop was even going to be more severe, but it wasn't. Instead, we plateaued right around 2.1 million TEUs. What we didn't expect was this massive whiplash that we have in the month of July with 2.6 million TEUs coming into the United States. Next, we have the top 10 U.S. ports post strong gains in July with growth across all the major gateways. This is showing you the transition from June of 2025 to July of 2025, and every port experienced an uptick. On average, across the 10 ports, 20.4%, a net increase of almost 380,000 TEU, with nearly every port clocking in at double digits. Tacoma, Washington was the one exception there. Third, China origin imports rebound significantly in July. So U.S. containerized imports from China rose sharply to 923,000 TEUs in July. That's a 44.4% increase over June, marking the strongest monthly volume since January. You may remember, we expected to see this huge drop-off from imports from China, and you're seeing that there. This index, which sets July 2024 as the 100% level, we saw that massive drop there in May and June, but now it is ticking back up. Plus, U.S. imports in general are actually higher than they were in July of 2024. The top products we're seeing coming in from China right now, furniture and bedding, plastics and machinery, they are the top three categories. They together account for over 38% of those China origin TEUs. Now, this doesn't mean everything is better. Obviously, the elevated tariffs have intensified custom enforcement, and back in June, there was an enactment of a 40% U.S. tariff on re-exports coming from Vietnam. That was intended to crack down on those shipments coming out of China to Vietnam and trying to come in under the cover of Vietnam's tariffs. So where are those China origin containers going? Well, as you can see here, that 42.9% increase from June to July, but where are they going? Well, Houston's getting over 122% of those containers. In New York, New Jersey, 69.5%, Savannah, 90%, with LA and Long Beach roughly around 30%. If we look at U.S. imports from the top 10 countries of origin, the surge in July was led by increases from China and Hong Kong. We see a 25.4% general increase, reflecting 382,000 TEUs. China 44.4% and Hong Kong 47.8%. If we go year over year, we can see that growth out of Asia more significantly, with Vietnam at 20.9%, India at 24%, Thailand at 23.8%, and Japan at 12.1%. So probably one of my favorite graphs from the Descartes report is this one, which is showing East Coast and Gulf Coast ports versus West Coast ports. And you can see the impact the tariff has had in the early half of 2025, where you were trying to surge cargo into the United States in front of the tariff windows. And you can see how it flips because of the elongated route from East Asia over to the East Coast of the United States. You got to go around Africa because of the Houthi. That creates a delay. And so what you see is the East and West Coast ports kind of flip there in March, again in April, again in May, and once again in June. So despite a dramatic increase in July imports, volume at the top U.S. ports, transit time delays have increased only modestly over June. That's kind of indicating that the ports are absorbing the added pressure without a lot of major disruptions. Really experiencing some small increases in delay. The only major one we see is Tacoma, which showed a modest decrease in delays, improving to 2.9 days from where they were in May and June. So U.S. Gulf Coast imports rose sharply in July, and this really shows you the volatility of shipping we're seeing with the tariffs. This is a heartbeat of a squirrel on crack here. It's all over the place. These recent fluctuations may reflect the kind of growing sensitivity to the policy shifts and the front-loading cycles that are continue to ripple across the market. So whenever these tariffs come down, you see shippers front load their cargo, load as much cargo as they can to get across into the United States. Remember, one of the things that's important to note is that tariffs are determined usually on when they're loaded on the ship, not when they land in the United States. So if you can get cargo onto the ship and before the tariff hits, you're good. And getting to the Gulf Coast is the longest sail time. It's the one that takes the longest to get to. And I think that's why we're seeing that reflected in that chart. So as of July 2025, the U.S.-China trade relationship remains under a very fragile truce. We were at a high of 145% tariff. That is now down to 30%, but not on everything. There are additional tariffs on certain items that are in there. We have a 90-day suspension that takes us through into October. Typically, the peak season we see is September, October to get everything in before the holiday season. We think a lot of cargo was sitting in China waiting to get loaded to see if this dropped. That's why we had those low May and June numbers. It's also why we had the high numbers prior to the year in Q1 and the very beginning of the second quarter. We saw those peak numbers. And again, what we're seeing is front loading. Get all the cargo you can out. Now, that doesn't work for everything. You can't front load cargo that is, time sensitive, that has an expiration date, or that hasn't been produced yet because there may not just be lying around there. And that is going to impact this cycle. Now, there are other factors at play that are impacting the global trade cycle. Let's not forget the Houthi and their now, declared fourth phase of attacks. We just had Israel announce that they're going to initiate a blockade against the Houthi. The Houthi have a blockade against Israel. What does that mean going forward? We had 2 high visibility sinkings out in the Red Sea. That's impacting shipping. We have not seen the return of traffic. Traffic through the Bab el-Mandab remains approximately 50% below the early 2024 levels. So Descartes puts a couple of issues out here to watch. First one, expanded tariffs and other potential protectionist trade policies. Obviously, the US and China, along with the European Union and a whole variety of other countries, are really looking at reshuffling the idea of tariffs. And so we're seeing issues like the exemption of de minimis shipments. We saw that with China back in May, but now it's going to be done across the board. We're seeing reciprocal tariffs take effect on August 1st on over 60 countries, including the EU, Canada, Japan, and Mexico, with rates rising. So all these issues are going to be ones that we have to keep an eye on. We need to be watching exactly what the impact is having in the U.S. ports. Everybody's screaming and shouting that U.S. ports are empty. Don't buy that. You've got to look at the data, being these peaks and troughs. So we're getting this really interesting spikes, both on the high side and the low side. And July will definitely reflect, in my opinion, a lot of pre-tariff front loading and a lot of these temporary reprieves. People are trying to get cargo in very quickly. We need to watch these port transit wait times. If they decrease, that is an indication of an improved global supply chain. We're getting efficiencies, goods are moving. But if they go the other way, then that may show us that port capacity is tightening and that ports may be becoming overwhelmed. The issue here is that the ports may be dealing with these peaks and troughs, and those surges, those waves, will overwhelm not just the ports, their ability to offload and get them on the terminal, but for the infrastructure in the interior, the road, the rail, the warehousing, to be able to absorb that. They've been able to do that so far. A lot of it has to do with lessons learned from the global supply chain crisis back in the early 2020s. So the biggest issue is how this impacts the economy. Remember, I am a shipping expert. I am talking to you about imports into U.S. ports. I'm talking to you about the volume of traffic. But the biggest problem here is how this affects the economics of the United States, which is an import-driven economy. And with this truce between the U.S. and China regarding the tariffs set to expire in October, we could see renewed issues facing the global economic situation. And let's not forget conflicts. Again, in the case of Descartes, they're really highlighting the Middle East conflict, the diversion that is still going on due to the Houthis and the escalation between the Houthis and the Israelis. I will also add what is happening in the South China Sea right now. I think the confrontation between the Philippines and China has the potential to escalate even more. Let's not forget Russia, Ukraine, the Black Sea. Let's not forget issues in the Baltic Sea. We've got a lot of issues going on in the sea around there. So conflict is definitely one to be considering. So in the short term, Descartes recommends considering modeling the impacts of expanded U.S. tariffs. They use the model here of what happened regarding the August 7th start of India-specific tariffs and the universal copper tariff. India specifically was targeted because of its import of Russian oil. That's been an issue regarding the Russia-Ukraine conflict. They talk about monitoring port volumes and delays to assess the possibility of trade disruptions if volumes persist between that 2.4 to 2.6 million levels, and that have historically stressed U.S. maritime logistical infrastructure. They recommend tracking, obviously, the conflicts in and around the region. They focus on the Red Sea, the Houthi, the Iran-Israel tensions. I think you need to be looking globally at a lot of other geopolitical areas. And then finally, evaluate the impact of inflation, the Russia-Ukraine, Israel-Hamas. Iran-Israel conflicts on the logistics cost and capacity constraints. One of the things that we're seeing that's happening with these conflicts is cargo has to go much longer. We're increasing ton miles. So, historically over the past decade, a ton of cargo typically sailed about 4,500 miles. Now it's sailing about 5,200 miles. And that cost raises shipping expenses. It raises the freight rates. Also, it puts a lot of pressure on certain types of vessels, tankers and bulkers, because there's not been a huge replacement program out there for them the way we've seen with containers. Finally, in the near term, they're having companies that are moving cargo through the Straits of Hormuz, the Suez Canal, to really evaluate the impact of those extended reroutings. Those aren't going away anytime soon. There's a lot of people predicting 2025, we see the end of that. I don't think it goes away. And I have to tell you that even if the Houthi tomorrow came out and say, peace in the Middle East, everything's good, Israel gets out of Gaza, everything ends, it doesn't mean shipping returns back immediately. And then finally, on their longer term, evaluate supplier and factory location density to mitigate reliance on overtaxed trade lanes and regions of the globe that have the potential for conflict. Density creates economy of scale, but also risk and subsequent logistic capacity crisis highlights the downside. Conflicts do not happen overnight, so now is an optimal time to address the potential business disrupting issue. I think one of the things that we've seen, at least since the birth of this channel in March of 2021, when Ever Given went sideways in the Suez, is how geopolitics plays a role in the global shipping network. We are definitely seeing that happen. You have to build in resiliency into your supply chain. The problem with resiliency in a supply chain is it adds costs. That means you're paying more for shipping. That means you're going longer routes. That means you're diversifying your carriers. It means you're not 100% reliant on one group to haul your cargo, or one supplier, or one shipping company. All of that translates to you, the consumer, the shipper, as additional costs, which means that trade costs are going to go up. We are not going to see that return to pre-COVID rates across the board. We're just not going to see it. We saw it for a brief moment at the end of 2023, but factors came to play and it bounced back up again. And when you look at the freight rates and you look at what we're seeing that kind of just pendulum of rates happening across the board. And this is going to continue. Yes, tariffs are self-inflicted by the United States. We're deciding to do that through the Trump administration. But now other countries are doing reciprocal tariffs. And don't think for a minute that when Trump leaves, tariffs goes away, because one of the things we saw in the first term of President Trump is tariffs remained in place during the Biden administration. And other countries are going to do the same. This is creating a whole new dynamic when it comes to global shipping. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? You hit the super thanks button down below, or head on over to Patreon and become a monthly, yearly subscriber. I'll have the link to this Descartes story. You can see the whole article out there. I strongly recommend following them. I think they're a great source. They have a newsletter. You can get information posted from them. They are an extremely good source of information. I use them a lot along with many others. Until our next episode, this is Sal, signing off.